Welcome back to Lesson 3. We're going to look at Chapter 3 in your textbook, The American Yacht, British North America. I'm going to break this down into two lessons. Lesson 3A, the British colonies develop, and Lesson 3B, the colonies mature. In this lesson, we're going to focus on Lesson 3A, the British colonies develop. We have a few objectives to differentiate between the British North American colonies. So I'm going to go through several different regions of the American colonies, and I will give you a few examples of colonies within those regions. So I'm going to talk about the Chesapeake, I'm going to talk about New England, and I'll even talk about Southern colonies. So we need to be able to tell the difference between some of these colonies, like their labor systems, why they were started, their economic systems. Do they rely on slave labor? We also want to be able to compare and contrast the motives for colonization in British North America. So why did people set up a colony in this particular colony? Why was Virginia started compared to why was Georgia started? We also want to discuss relationships between Native Americans and settlers throughout the British North American colonies. So last week we talked about the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. They were over land in Virginia. So we want to be able to look at various different examples of Native Americans and settlers interacting throughout North America and how their relationships develop over time. In the last lesson we talked about the English entering the colonization game in North America. We said they set up Jamestown as their first permanent colony, and Jamestown was a Chesapeake colony. This map says Southern colonies, Virginia and Maryland, but Virginia and Maryland are really Chesapeake colonies. The Southern colonies are going to be North Carolina, South Carolina, which were actually the Carolina colony to begin with, and Georgia. We're going to talk about those different colonies as we move forward today, but we're also going to talk about middle colonies like Pennsylvania and New York, and New England colonies like Massachusetts. I'm not going to go in a geographic order because we've already talked about Virginia as a Chesapeake colony, and we've talked about Massachusetts Bay a little. So I'm going to take more of a chronological approach because Virginia was the first colony established. This map also does a good job highlighting the fact that the British were not the only people in North America. There are Native Americans in North America at the time. This map says that they're in this orange territory called Indian Territory, but the Native Americans were not only on the other side of the Appalachian Mountain. They're also coexisting in these colonies. In addition to that, the Spanish control what we now know as Florida. So the English are not the only people in North America. We've also talked about the French establishing New France in present-day Canada. We know that there are not a lot of people there, but they're still there, and they're a threat to the British. The first region we'll talk about is the Chesapeake because it is the home of the first permanent British North American colony, Jamestown. We're going to look at two examples, Virginia and Maryland. As we talk about the establishment of Virginia as a colony, it's mostly going to be recap from the last lesson. But hitting the highlights, we know that the Virginia Company was established in 1606 as a joint stock company. Joint stock companies were where people invested in a company and they invest a lot of their own capital into that company and they expect to get a return. So Virginia was set up for commercial purposes, and 144 men and boys set sail to what would become Jamestown, and they land in Jamestown on the James River in 1607. The living conditions early on were very harsh in Jamestown because they picked a place that wasn't the best place to pick. They picked a place that had brackish water, so salty water. They picked a location that was right in the middle of Native American territory. These settlers will get into conflict with both the Powhatan and the Susquehannock. And early on they struggle. They have poor health. In 1609 and 1610, they go through a period called the starving times. They literally think that they're going to starve. It doesn't look like the Virginia Company's goal of making money or making profit is going to work out. But by 1616, tobacco, a specific type of tobacco called broadleaf tobacco, will become a major cash crop for Jamestown. But we know that tobacco is a very labor-intensive crop, so the people that live in Virginia are looking for labor for their tobacco fields. The Virginia Company proposes something called the headright system. And the headright system basically said that for every settler that came to Jamestown in Virginia, they would get 50 acres. If they brought a servant with them, they would get 50 more acres. For each additional servant they brought with them, they would get 50 more acres. So, like I said last week, if you settle in Jamestown and you brought with you a certain number of servants, let's say they brought 10 servants with them, they would get 550 acres because they would get 50 acres for settling and 500 for bringing 10 indentured servants. So indentured servitude was the preferred method of labor for these tobacco fields very early on because people could gain land by bringing indentured servants to Jamestown. We went over what an indentured servant was, but most of the indentured servants signed a contract for 5 to 7 years. They agreed to work for 5 to 7 years in exchange for passage to Virginia and for food and shelter and clothing. The goal of many of these indentured servants was to serve out their term and to gain land ownership themselves. 1619 will be a very important year for Jamestown for 3 reasons. Jamestown sets up a system of government called the House of Burgesses. The second thing, the first slaves arrive in British North America in Jamestown in 1619. There are about 20 of them. Lastly, 90 young maidens arrive in Jamestown. And this is very important for Jamestown because we know that there are a lot of men in Jamestown, a lot of English men in Jamestown, but there are not a lot of English women in Jamestown. When these 90 young maidens arrive from England, they will provide wives for many of the settlers and they will replenish the population of Jamestown and they will have families in Jamestown. In the last lesson, we also talked about the Anglo-Powhatan Wars, and they really center around clashes about land. As the settlers grow, they want more and more land, and they push into the interior. So they're pushing into Native American land, taking Native American land, and it leads to clashes. We covered these 3 wars that took place over the course of approximately 40 years. The first one started in 1609, and the second one wages in the 1620s. And during the time of the Second Anglo-Powhatan War, in 1624, the Virginia Company dissolves and Virginia a royal colony. So we know that Virginia is established as a royal colony in 1624, but the war between the English settlers and the Powhatan continues to wage on through the 1620s. The Third Anglo-Powhatan War breaks out in 1644 and it lasts until 1646. It all begins with a surprise attack where the Powhatan kill about 500 English colonists. But by the end of the war in 1646, the Powhatans were forced to acknowledge King Charles as their king. So we know that there are some tense relations with Virginia colonists and the natives around Virginia. After the Anglo-Powhatan Wars, people are still moving to Virginia, and many of them are still bringing indentured servants with them as well. One wealthy young Englishman comes to Virginia in 1674. His name was Nathaniel Bacon. Nathaniel Bacon tries to make friends with the royal governor William Berkeley, but he's not as close to William Berkeley as he would hope. He wants land on Virginia's frontier, but the governor does not want to get involved in warfare with Native Americans. He thought that it would be very bad for Virginians. But Bacon continues to push to expand into Virginia's frontier, especially in 1675. Bacon will look to former indentured servants who want land, and many of these former indentured servants believe that the Governor Berkeley was limiting economic opportunities by denying them access to the frontier land. Bacon and these former indentured servants really saw Native Americans as obstacle to land, and they began pushing for more land on the frontier in 1675. And tensions between these Virginia colonists and Native Americans will actually lead to open conflict in 1675. Susquehannock warriors are actually going to attack the Virginia frontier, and they kill English planters and they destroy some English plantations. One of the plantations that they destroy is actually owned by Bacon. Nathaniel Bacon's not killed during this attack, but his plantation is destroyed. The following year, in 1676, Bacon and other Virginians will attack the Susquehannocks without the governor's approval. And this really makes Governor William Berkeley upset. He actually orders the arrest of Nathaniel Bacon, but instead of allowing Berkeley to arrest him, Bacon takes his followers to Jamestown, and they force the governor to flee, and they light Jamestown on fire. So they burn Jamestown. Eventually, King Charles II will learn about Bacon's rebellion, and he'll send royal troops and English commissioners to get the colony under order. By the end of 1676, Virginians that were loyal to Berkeley gain the upper hand, and they're going to capture several of the leaders in Bacon's rebellion, and several of them will be executed. Bacon himself will not be hung. Instead, he will get a disease called dysentery, and he will die from dysentery, and basically what he died of is bloody diarrhea. Bacon's rebellion will end by the end of 1676, but it is significant because it is the catalyst for the creation of race-based slavery, and we will see a rise in race-based slavery in the Chesapeake colonies after 1676. So we know that slavery already exists, but there will be new laws put into place that will really establish this race-based slavery system. For instance, in 1680, there were several laws passed on slavery. An example is prohibiting free blacks and slaves from bearing arms. Another is banning blacks from congregating in large numbers. And thirdly, they established laws that would have harsh punishments for slaves who assaulted Christians or attempt to escape. 2 years later, in 1682, Virginia passed a law that made slaves for life. So we know that under this system of racial slavery, it is chattel slavery, and we know that they view slaves as property, not as people. Maryland is another colony in the Chesapeake. It is actually the first proprietary colony in English North America. King Charles I grants this charter to Lord Baltimore in 1632. Lord Baltimore was a man named George Calvert, and he had done a lot for the English monarch. So King Charles II grants this proprietary colony to Lord Baltimore. Lord Baltimore dies in 1632, and his son, Lord Baltimore II, establishes Maryland as a haven for persecuted Catholics. Catholics in England are persecuted because the state religion in England at the time is the Church of England, so the Catholics in England are being persecuted. So Lord Baltimore is actually Catholic, and he's looking for a place as a haven for these Catholic people in England. So he will establish this colony, Maryland. The first people to arrive in Maryland are a group of English people, both Catholic and Protestant. There are about 200 of them. They arrive in Maryland in March of 1634. Rich Catholics, the Catholic aristocracy, are going to bring Protestant servants with them, and we really see something that looks like feudalism emerge in Maryland, where you have rich Catholics that rule over a large piece of land, and they have Protestant servants. Tobacco will be very important to Maryland, and for the labor system, very early on, Maryland will operate under the headright system. The proprietor, which is Lord Baltimore II, will grant people that move to Maryland 50 acres, and for each servant they brought with them, he would give them 50 acres. So very similar to what's going on in Virginia. Even though Maryland is set up as a Catholic haven, very quickly Maryland becomes more Protestant because there is a level of Christian religious tolerance in Maryland. We'll shift and talk about the English colonies, and our examples are the Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay Colony. We've actually already talked about Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay in Lesson 2, but I'm going to quickly reinforce some of the material that we learned. So I want to recap some of the stuff we talked about in Lesson 2. If we look at England in the 1500s, there's a lot of religious instability. Henry VIII, who was once the defender of the Catholic Church in the 1530s, creates his own church, the Church of England, because he wants an annulment from his first wife. So he turns England from a Catholic nation to a Protestant nation. But he doesn't really change a lot when he establishes the Church of England. He establishes himself as the head of the church, but they're still using the same hierarchy as the Catholic Church. They're still archbishops and bishops, and they still have some of the same rituals as the Catholic Church. He dies and he has one male heir, but his male heir dies at age 15, and this leaves Henry VIII's oldest daughter, Mary, as the Queen of England. Mary was Catholic and she turned England back to Catholicism. She's actually nicknamed Bloody Mary because she had many English Protestants executed. Many of them were even burned to death because of Bloody Mary. She dies in 1558 and she doesn't have an heir, so her half sister becomes the Queen of England. Her name's Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth I. When Queen Elizabeth takes the throne in 1558, she brings back Protestantism in England. The Church of England is again the official state church in England. In 1558, it still has the same hierarchy as the Catholic Church, and it still resembles the Catholic Church as far as rituals go. By the 1580s, there are a group of reformers that call for the Church of England to be purified. They want anything that they deem unscriptural removed from the Church of England. Many of these reformers will eventually be called Puritans. They wanted to remove what they deemed as unscriptural elements from the church. An example is they wanted to remove decorative items from the church. Puritans also followed Calvinism, and we talked about Calvinism in lesson 2, but John Calvin established Calvinism. He believed that people should be able to read the Bible, so they should have an English Bible in England, a French Bible in France. He also believed in something called predestination. Predestination basically means that God is omnipotent, He's all powerful, humans are powerless, and He knows that a certain group of people will go to heaven, so He selected a specific group to go to heaven, and the rest will go to hell, so the rest are damned. So there's an elect group that's selected by God, and that's predestinations. The Puritans believe in this. They read a Bible called the Geneva Bible, which is Calvin's translation of the Bible. A new king comes into power right in the middle of this debate within the Church of England. There's several people pushing for purification of the Church of England, but King James is the head of the Church of England, and he wants to make sure this remains this way. He comes into power in 1603. In 1604, he calls for something called the Hampton Court Conference to write a new Bible, the Bible that will be used by the Church of England, and it is called the King James Bible. It's published in 1611. He does not want people to rely on the Geneva Bible. He wants them to rely on the King James Bible. There's a lot of tension between King James and the Puritans. There's also another group of people that emerged called the Separatists. They were Puritans, but they take it a step further. They want to completely separate from the Church of England because they do not believe that the Church of England can be purified in the way that it should. In lesson 2, we looked at both the Plymouth Colony and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Plymouth Colony is set up by separatists, so the Pilgrims are actually called separatists. In 1609, there were a group of separatists that had moved to Holland, and they were raising their families in Holland, but their children had a lack of Englishness. So some of these separatists wanted to move back to the English world, and they chose to move to an English colony to be part of this English world. And in 1620, the separatist William Bradford will launch this move. Many of these separatists in Holland will go back to England, and they'll gather up a few more separatists, and they'll board a ship called the Mayflower. They're headed to Virginia, but they get blown off course a little bit, and they land in Cape Cod, which is called Plymouth or Plymouth Rock, on November 9th, 1620. 2 days later, the men on the Plymouth, they signed something called the Mayflower Compact on November 11th, 1620. This Mayflower Compact basically states the purpose of the Plymouth colony. They say that it is established for religious purposes, so it's very different from Virginia that was set up for commercial purposes. The Plymouth colony is set up for religious purpose. They reach shore in the middle of winter and they don't have structures built, so they decide to winter on the Mayflower. Many of the people will become sick on the Mayflower and die. The remaining settlers, when the winter is over, they settle in Plymouth in March of 1621, and we know that there are some early agreements between the Plymouth colony and Native Americans in March of 1621, but these break down very quickly. In lesson 2, we also talked about the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Massachusetts Bay Colony is a group of Puritans. In 1629, there's a royal charter issued to wealthy Puritans to establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Their leader was a man named John Winthrop, and he lived from 1606 to 1676, and he believed that Massachusetts Bay should be a city upon a hill. He actually has this quote, "We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." Remember, the Puritans want to purify the Church of England. They don't want to break away from the Church of England. So they really want to be a city upon a hill, and they want the Church of England and others to look to them as an example of what moral Christianity should look like. We also talked about Puritan society. We know that there's a social hierarchy and men are at the top. It's a very patriarchal society with big families that operated as little commonwealth. Basically, what this means is the man rules the household just like the governor would rule Massachusetts Bay. They operate in a domestic economy where families work together in a household unit to produce what they would survive on. We know that the Puritans really valued literacy because they believed reading the Bible would help them understand their spirituality. They believe reading the Bible would help them understand their salvation or reveal their salvation. So education and literacy is very important to Puritans, and for that reason the first printing press in English America is established in 1636. In addition, they will establish Harvard University in 1636 to provide theological training for young Puritans. Over time, there were several dissenting Puritans. We talked about Thomas Hooker, Roger Williams, and Anne Hutchinson. Thomas Hooker goes on to find another colony in New England. He establishes the colony of Connecticut, and Roger Williams is also a dissenter. He doesn't like the fact that the Puritans continue to take Native American land. Roger Williams will establish a colony called the Colony of Rhode Island, Providence Plantations. It will actually be an important colony for Baptists as they take a foothold in North America. Lastly, there's a dissenting Puritan called Anne Hutchinson, and she's the female dissenter we're going to talk about. She spoke out against Puritan leaders. She said that a lot of these Puritan ministers are preaching something called a salvation of works. Basically, if you did good works, you could get into heaven. She said, no, that is not right. The only way you can get into heaven is through God's grace. So she talks about salvation through God's grace, and she says that the Puritan ministers are doing wrong by teaching a salvation of works. She is actually going to be brought to court by the Puritans, and they exile her from Massachusetts Bay. She'll go to Roger Williams' colony for a short period of time in the 1640s, but shortly thereafter she moves to New Amsterdam. And while she's in New Amsterdam, her family is attacked by a group of natives, and she's executed by the Native Americans. In 1642. The longer that Puritans are in New England, the more land that they want. The leader of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, said, "If God were not pleased with us inheriting these parts, then why doeth he make room for us by diminishing them as we increase?" And really what he's talking about is as the Puritans' population grows, the number of Native Americans in that area are decreasing for several reasons. Number one, the Puritans brought disease with them, and number two, there's a lot of warfare going on. Some Puritans wanted to spread their religion to the Native Americans. An example of this is a Puritan missionary named John Eliot. And John Eliot went into places called praying towns. They were towns established by Massachusetts Bay for converted Native Americans that had converted to Christianity. And John Eliot went into these towns, and he was a missionary to the Algonquin people. And he actually publishes an Algonquin Bible in 1663 so the Algonquin people can read the Bible in their own language. That's very important to the Puritan faith for people to be able to read the Bible in their own language. So the Algonquin people have a Bible that they can read, and Eliot tries to convert many natives. Disputes over land will lead to several conflicts between New England settlers and Native Americans. I'm going to talk about two particular skirmishes between natives and English colonists. I'm going to talk about the Pequot War and King Philip's War. The Pequot War lasts from 1636 to 1638, and on one side you've got Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay with their allies, Narragansett and Mohicans. On the other side you have the Pequot. One example of an event that takes place during the Pequot War is the Mystic River Massacre. It occurs on May 26, 1637 in Connecticut. An English captain named John Mason is marching alone with his troops. He has about 380 men. Some of his men are Narragansett, some of them are Mohican. They march to the Pequot Fort at Mystic River, and they surround this fort at Mystic River. They block the two exits, and they light fire to the Pequot Fort at Mystic River. By the end of this Mystic River massacre, Captain Mason's men have killed between 400 and 700 Pequot men, women, and children. Most of them are women, and there are very few survivors. We know that the Pequot War is an example of warfare fought over land and tensions between Native Americans and English settlers. Another example is King Philip's War. King Philip's War takes place from 1675 to 1676, the same time that Bacon's Rebellion is going on in Virginia. The reason that King Philip's War breaks out is because natives and English colonists are fighting over land in the Connecticut River Valley. On one side you have the Wampanoags, led by Chief Metacomet. The English often call him King Philip. He leads the Wampanoag people, but they're also allied with groups like the Nipmunks and the Narragansett. They will fight against the New England colonies, including Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, and Connecticut. These New England colonies have allied themselves with the Mohican and some of the Christian natives, especially the natives that live in the praying towns. And they fight this war from about 1675 to 1676. By the end of King Philip's War, King Philip or Metacomet is dead. Metacomet is killed at the Battle of Mount Hope near Providence, Rhode Island. And by the end of this war, the English settlers have taken this land, and that tensions between natives and English settlers remain. The Puritans bring with them supernatural beliefs. The way that they interpret the world and nature goes along with their religion. For instance, a natural disaster could be interpreted as God, or it could be interpreted as demons or the devil doing something. During the 1600s, Puritans will call out and accuse many people of witchcraft. Over the course of the 1600s or the 17th century, 342 New England women are accused of witchcraft. In the 1600s, most of the people that are accused of witchcraft are women, and most were unmarried or childless, or widows, or had bad reputations. These women were seen as a burden on Puritan society. We talked about the Puritan social hierarchy. They want big families. Well, if women don't get married, or if they're childless, or if they have a bad reputation, they're not fitting into this Puritan social hierarchy. And many of those people will be targeted because they're seen as a burden on Puritan society. But the Salem witch trials fit into this century of accusations, but they're mass accusations during the Salem witch trial. And it occurs from 1692 to 1693. About 200 people are accused of being witches from 1692 to 1693. And this time it includes some men. Out of the 200 people that are accused of witchcraft, about 19 people are executed. 5 of them are men. And you can actually watch a really interesting documentary on the Salem witch trial. And it talks about how the witch trial starts. One of the persons that will be accused of witchcraft very early on is a woman called Tituba. But we wonder why. Why does this mass accusation of witchcraft occur from 1692 to 1693 in Salem Village in Massachusetts? One reason is that there's a local problem about land. Some people don't agree with one another and they're arguing with one another, especially about land, and this leads to tension. Another is there's a Salem village and a Salem town, and they're competing with one another. And there's also church politics. So all of these factor into the Salem witch trials. I recommend checking out the documentary. It's called Salem Witch Trials. It's put out by the History Channel. But if you don't have time for that, you will have time for reading one of your primary readings. The primary reading for this week actually looks at somebody that is interrogated during the Salem witch trials. But if you have any questions about the Salem witch trials and its origins, please let me know. But there are a lot of tensions in Salem. To understand how the Middle Colonies come to be, we need to look at how King Charles II becomes king. King Charles II is the son of King Charles I, who had been very unpopular with the Puritans because he married a French Catholic princess who continued to practice Catholicism. Eventually, King Charles I had suspended Parliament for 11 years. It was suspended throughout the 1630s, and an English civil war breaks out between the monarchy, with King Charles I and his supporters, versus Parliament, which was led by a man named Oliver Cromwell. This civil war lasts from 1642 to 1649. Parliament and their supporters come out victorious in 1649. They capture Charles I and they try him for treason and behead him. After this, we're in a period of English history when there is no king. It's actually a republic from 1649 to about 1660, and Parliament's leader Oliver Cromwell will rule, and he's fairly popular early on, but he makes enemies as time moves on. He dies in 1658, and his son Richard, who really lacks political skills and ambition, takes over. And a lot of people in England look at this as being just another monarchy. Cromwell has passed the leadership to his son, so a hereditary position. And a lot of people don't like this and they don't think he has the leadership skills that he needs. So they turn to the old kings, King Charles I's son, King Charles II. King Charles II will become king in 1660, and this will end Cromwellian England, and it starts something called Restoration England. It gets the nickname Restoration England because the monarchy has been restored in 1660. And from 1660 to the 1680s, King Charles II is going to usher in Restoration England. His goal is to build up English colonies. He wants to make England very strong, and he wants to stabilize the monarchy. One of the things that he has his eye on is the Dutch colony of New Netherlands. The English actually engaged in warfare with the Dutch during the 1650s and 1660s. They engaged in something called the Anglo-Dutch Wars. By 1664, the English have gained control of the New Netherlands, and Charles II actually gives this colony to his brother, the Duke of York. His name's James. And the colony and the city will be named New York in honor of James, the Duke of York. But the Anglo-Dutch Wars are not over yet. A third Anglo-Dutch War takes place from 1672 to 1674, where the Dutch try to recapture the colony. They do for a short period of time, but by the end of the Third Anglo-Dutch War in 1674, the English had regained control. In 1683, New York will hold a assembly meeting, and it's a local representative legislature, and that group will publish something called the New York's Charter of Liberties and Privileges. And in that, it basically says that New Yorkers would have the traditional rights of Englishmen. They would have rights like the trial by jury and the right to have a representative government. It also sets up 12 counties in New York. In the 1700s, New York will remain a very religiously diverse colony. In New York City, you'll have Jewish, Puritans, Quakers, Anglicans. And we know that New York also has a very large slave population. The very same year that Charles II gives his brother New York, he gives New Jersey to Sir George Carteret and Lord Berkeley. And there is some religious freedom in all of New Jersey as well. So, in that sense, there's some religious freedom in New York and some religious freedom in New Jersey. So those are two examples of middle colonies. The last example of middle colonies will be Pennsylvania. In 1681, Charles II will give the largest proprietary colony in English America to William Penn. The reason that he gives William Penn such a large tract of land is because he needed to settle a debt that he owed to the Penn family. Penn's father had actually served the English monarchy, and he helped take Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655. For this reason, the English monarchy and Charles II owe the Penn family. So, to pay that debt, King Charles II will give Pennsylvania to William Penn. William Penn was a member of the Society of Friends. The Society of Friends was a new religious denomination set up by a man named George Fox in the late 1640s. Basically, Fox did not agree with the Puritans and their belief in predestination. He did not believe in predestination, so he broke away from the Puritans and started his own denomination called the Society of Friends. He basically said that everyone had an inner light, and that inner light dwelled within them. They actually got the nickname Quakers because when the inner light moved within them, they quaked. So William Penn is a Quaker, and he believes in this inner light being dwelling within everyone. And so when he sets up Pennsylvania in the 1680s, he really views it as a place where Quakers could go. So many of the early settlers come to Pennsylvania for religious reasons. It's important to talk about the link between Pennsylvania and the Barbados. In the mid 1600s, many Quakers were being persecuted in England, and they fled to English colonies, particularly in the Barbados, where they set up sugar plantations, and many of the Quakers owned slaves. But when William Penn sets up Pennsylvania, many of these Quakers that lived in the Barbados will move to Pennsylvania, and they'll bring their slaves with them. William Penn will establish a colony with some level of religious tolerance. It is probably the most religious tolerant colony throughout English America. He also wants to attract new immigrants to his colony. He promised 50 acres of land to people who would agree to come to Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania will rely on indentured servitude more than any other colony, more than Virginia, more than Maryland. So there are indentured servants in Pennsylvania, but there's also slavery in Pennsylvania as well. One thing that Quakers believed in was pacifism, and this is one reason that William Penn tries to establish friendly relationships with Native Americans. For instance, in 1701, he signs a treaty with the Susquehannocks to avoid war. But as we know, relationships between English settlers and natives eventually break down over land, and you can learn more about that when we talk about the 1700s. The last thing we'll talk about in Lesson 3A are the southern colonies. We're going to talk about the colony of Carolina and the colony of Georgia. Carolina was started by Charles II. Remember, Charles II ushered in Restoration England, and his goal was to expand colonies for the English monarchy. So in 1663, he issues a charter to establish a new colony called Carolina in between Virginia and Spanish Florida. He really wanted to create a buffer zone in between Spanish Florida and Virginia. He awards 8 of his supporters this territory. They each get a particular region, but they don't move to Carolina. They want to make money off of Carolina. The earliest settlers really come from the English Caribbean. And in 1670, a group of English settlers from the Barbados and Bermuda established what is called Charlestown. It's named for the King Charles II. Today it's called Charleston. Over time, in the late 1600s and early 1700s, there's a divide between the southern region of Carolina and the northern region. Their economies are very different. In the South, their economies are based off of cash crops like rice and indigo, and people are also growing livestock. In the North, they are harvesting turpentine from trees for shipping industries and tobacco. But Carolina, as a colony, relies heavily on slave labor. By 1715, the southern part of Carolina had a black majority living in the colony. The link with the Barbados in the southern part of the colony meant that many of the Barbados slave codes would be implemented in Carolina. These laws made the African slaves property, and they were bought and sold as commodities. There are also going to be slaves in the northern part of the state as well, especially on the tobacco farms. By 1729, it's very obvious that Carolina has two different distinct regions, the southern part and the northern part, and they have different economic and political goals. For this reason, they will be split into two, South Carolina and North Carolina. But before they were split into two, there was difficulty with the Carolina settlers and natives. So let's take a look at an example of tensions between Carolina settlers and native. It's called the Yamasee War, and it takes place from 1715 to 1717. The Yamasee people lived in what is present-day South Carolina, and they had been trading partners with the British colonists, especially the fur trade. They were providing fur for these British colonists. But over time, the British colonists were moving into the frontier where these Yamasee people lived in the Carolina colony, and tensions developed. Eventually, two English colonists were sent to discuss issues with the Yamasee, but they were killed. And the Yamasee began killing traders over time. And they moved toward Charleston. A group of Yamasee and other native allies moved toward Charleston, and they were going to take Charleston. But the English colonists turned to the Cherokee and asked for help. The English colonists made an ally with the Cherokee, and it allowed them to gain control and win this war. The last colony we're going to talk about is Georgia. It started as a utopia for debtors. The idea behind Georgia comes from a man named James Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe was a member of Parliament, and he really called for social reforms. He had walked the streets of London, and he saw debtors that were penniless on the streets. And at this time, people could go to jail for being debtors. So he goes to Parliament and to King George II and asked for a colony. King George II thought about it, and he realized that establishing Georgia would be a great idea because it would set a buffer zone between Spanish Florida and South Carolina. So, in 1732, King George II grants Oglethorpe and 20 other proprietors the colony of Georgia. Georgia was established as a place for the worthy poor to start over. He really wanted them to work and to set up a place for themselves. He would give each male immigrant 50 acres of land. He gave them tools and a year's worth of supplies. But he really wanted these immigrants to set up a farm where they could support themselves. He had a distinct vision for Georgia, and that vision included no alcohol and no slavery. But as colonists from places like South Carolina moved into Georgia, they brought slaves with them, and they disregarded Oglethorpe's vision. By 1750, we see a rise in the number of slaves that are in Georgia, especially they were brought in to harvest rice. So Oglethorpe's view was disregarded, and it was not a utopia. One interesting fact about Georgia is it was the only government-funded colonial project, and by this I mean Parliament actually paid for the migration of about 2,500 settlers to Georgia. But it does not turn out like Oglethorpe thought it would. Georgia becomes a colony that relies on slave labor.